What if I told you that somewhere in the remote mountains of Eastern Europe, there exists a battlefield where the dead refuse to stay dead? Where every full moon for the past 600 years, ghostly soldiers rise from the earth to fight the same battle over and over again, trapped in an endless cycle of violence and vengeance. This is not just another ghost story. This is the terrifying truth behind the Battle of Srebra Dolina. A conflict so brutal, so steeped in betrayal and bloodshed, that it seems to have torn a hole in reality itself. And tonight, I'm going to tell you why this battlefield has become one of the most cursed places on Earth, and why the local villagers would rather die than set foot on that accursed ground when the moon is full. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what happens to the rage of the dead? Where does all that fury, that desperate need for justice, go when a person dies with their final breath spent cursing their enemies? Because what happened at Srebra Dolina in 1424 suggests that sometimes, just sometimes, that rage is so powerful it refuses to let go. Our story begins in the winter of 1423, in the Kingdom of Moldavia, where two brothers, Radu, the Black, and Mircea, the Ruthless, were locked in a bitter civil war for the throne. These weren't ordinary siblings fighting over inheritance. These were men who had been twisted by years of violence, betrayal, and an almost supernatural hatred for each other. Radu, the elder brother, was known for his cruelty. He once ordered an entire village burned because a single peasant had looked at him the wrong way. His younger brother Mircea was no better. Legend says he kept a collection of his enemies' severed hands as trophies, each one carefully preserved and mounted in his castle's great hall. But their hatred went deeper than mere ambition. You see, both brothers had been in love with the same woman, Alina of Wallachia, a noble woman whose beauty was said to drive men to madness. When she chose Radu over Mircea, something broke inside the younger brother's mind. On their wedding night, Mircea snuck into the castle and murdered Alina in her bed, leaving her body arranged as if she were merely sleeping. With white roses placed over her heart, Radu found her the next morning. The scream he let out was heard throughout the entire kingdom, a sound so filled with anguish and rage that birds fell dead from the sky. From that moment on, the two brothers were locked in a war that would consume everything in its path. For months, their armies clashed across the countryside, leaving behind a trail of burned villages and mass graves. But it was in the valley of Srebra Dolina where their conflict would reach its horrific climax. On the night of March 15, 1424, Radu's spies brought him information that would change everything. They had discovered that Mircea had been using dark sorcery to strengthen his army, making pacts with entities that should never be bargained with. But more shocking still was the revelation that Mircea had been desecrating Alina's corpse, using her remains in his twisted rituals. Consumed by a fury that bordered on madness, Radu decided to end the war once and for all. He would meet his brother in single combat at Srebra Dolina, a valley that had been considered sacred by the local people for generations. What Radu didn't know was that this place had been used for human sacrifices by ancient tribes, and the soil itself was soaked with centuries of blood and suffering. The two armies arrived at the valley as the sun began to set on March 20th. According to the few surviving accounts, the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent energy as the brothers faced each other across the battlefield. Witnesses described how the temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath turned to ice, and how the horses refused to move forward, their eyes rolling back in terror. But the strangest detail comes from a monk named Brother Casimir, who was traveling through the region and witnessed the battle from a nearby hilltop. In his journal, which was discovered in a monastery vault just 50 years ago, he wrote that, as the battle began, he saw figures that weren't quite human moving among the soldiers. Tall, shadow-like beings that seemed to feed on the violence, growing more solid and real with each death. The battle itself was unlike anything the region had ever seen. Brother Casimir described it as less of a military engagement and more of a massacre driven by supernatural fury. Brothers killed brothers, fathers struck down their own sons, and the very earth began to bleed actual blood. pooling in crimson puddles that never seemed to dry. At the center of it all, Radu and Mercia fought with a savagery that defied human capability. Mercia had indeed been changed by his dark practices. Multiple witnesses described him as moving with inhuman speed, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light, his strength far beyond what any mortal man should possess. But Radu had his own supernatural aid. In his grief and rage, he had made his own bargain with forces beyond human understanding. As the brothers dueled, their conflict took on an almost ritualistic quality, as if they were performing some ancient ceremony of blood and vengeance. The end came just as the full moon reached its peak. According to Brother Casimir, both brothers struck fatal blows simultaneously. Radu's sword piercing Mercia's heart, just as Mercia's blade found Radu's throat. As they fell together, their blood mingling on the cursed ground, something extraordinary happened. The monk wrote that the very air seemed to tear open, revealing glimpses of what he called the realm of unending war. Every soldier who had died in the battle, instead of falling peacefully, began to scream in unison, their voices creating a sound so terrible that it shattered every piece of glass in the nearby villages. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The surviving soldiers fled the battlefield, leaving behind nearly 3,000 dead. The local villagers, terrified by what they had witnessed, refused to bury the bodies, claiming that the ground itself rejected them. But the story doesn't end there, because exactly 1 month later, on the next full moon, something impossible happened. Every single one of those 3,000 soldiers rose from where they had fallen and began fighting again, their ghostly forms locked in the same battle. They had died fighting. This wasn't a peaceful haunting or a simple ghost sighting. This was war continuing beyond death, with the same fury, the same violence, the same desperate hatred that had consumed the living armies. The phantom soldiers fought with rusted weapons and tattered banners, their armor corroded and their flesh hanging in ribbons. But their rage burned as bright as ever. The villagers who witnessed this supernatural resurrection described it as the most terrifying sight imaginable. The ghostly armies would rise from the earth as the moon reached its peak, fight their eternal battle until dawn, and then fade away, leaving behind only the lingering smell of decay and the echo of clashing steel. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. Over the centuries, people have tried to investigate the battlefield. Historians, paranormal researchers, even military experts have attempted to study the phenomenon. Almost none of them have returned unchanged. In 1867, a team of archaeologists from Vienna attempted to excavate the site. Of the 12 men who entered the valley, only 3 emerged, and they were found the next morning wandering the countryside, completely mad, speaking in languages that no one could identify and drawing symbols in their own blood. In 1931, a group of Nazi occultists, fascinated by reports of supernatural activity, established a research station at the edge of the valley. Within a week, the entire team had vanished. When their bodies were finally found, they had been arranged in ritualistic patterns, and each man appeared to have died from wounds that matched ancient weapons, swords and arrows from the 15th century. Even more recently, in 1998, a documentary crew from National Geographic attempted to film the phenomenon during a full moon. Their equipment malfunctioned, their cameras captured only static and distorted images of figures in armor, and their sound engineer recorded what he described as the screaming of thousands of souls in agony. The project was quietly cancelled, and all footage was sealed away. The most chilling account comes from Dr. Helena Varga, a historian from the University of Bucharest, who spent 20 years studying the Shribra Dolina phenomenon. In her final report, published just before her mysterious disappearance in 2003, she wrote that the battlefield wasn't just haunted by the dead soldiers, it was haunted by war itself, by the very concept of violence and hatred given supernatural form. According to Dr. Varga, the battle had created what she called a temporal wound, a place where the past refuses to become the past, where the dead cannot rest because their fury is too great to be contained by death. She theorized that Radu and Mercia's supernatural hatred had torn a hole in reality itself, creating a place where the worst aspects of human nature could manifest as physical entities. Her last journal entry, found in her abandoned campsite, contained a single, terrifying observation. They're not just fighting each other anymore, they're recruiting. Each full moon, the army grows larger. Local folklore supports this disturbing possibility. Villagers report that people who die violent deaths within 50 miles of the valley sometimes don't stay dead when the full moon rises. Victims of murder, soldiers killed in combat, even those who die in fits of rage, have been seen joining the ghostly army, condemned to fight forever in a war that has no purpose beyond perpetuating itself. The Romanian government officially denies that anything unusual occurs at Srebra Dolina, but military satellites have captured infrared images showing massive heat signatures in the valley during full moons, patterns that match those of large-scale military engagements. Seismologists have detected rhythmic vibrations emanating from the site, vibrations that match the cadence of marching armies and the clash of weapons. Perhaps most disturbing of all are the reports from the few people who have observed the battlefield from a safe distance during a full moon manifestation. They describe seeing not just medieval soldiers, but warriors from every era of human conflict. Roman legionnaires fight alongside World War II infantry. Viking berserkers clash with modern special forces, all of them locked in the same endless, purposeless battle. And at the center of it all, every single full moon for the past 600 years, two figures can be seen dueling with supernatural intensity. Radu the Black and Mercia the Ruthless, still fighting their brother's war, still consumed by a hatred so pure and powerful that death itself cannot contain it. The battlefield of Srebra Dolina remains one of the most terrifying mysteries of our modern world, a place where the dead refuse to rest, where violence has taken on a life of its own, and where the worst aspects of human nature have been given supernatural form. But perhaps the most frightening aspect of this story isn't the ghostly army, or the cursed ground, or even the supernatural hatred that fuels this eternal war. It's the question that Dr. Varga posed in her final research notes. What happens when hatred becomes so powerful that it transcends death itself? What happens when human fury burns so bright that it tears holes in reality? Because if the Srebra Dolina phenomenon is real, and if Dr. Varga was correct about the growing army of the dead, then somewhere in the mountains of Eastern Europe, there exists a place where war itself has become immortal, where violence feeds on violence in an endless cycle that grows stronger with each passing century. The next full moon rises in just 3 days, and if you believe the stories, if you believe the eyewitness accounts, and the suppressed government reports, and the testimony of those brave or foolish enough to venture near that cursed valley, then somewhere in the darkness, 3,000 ghostly soldiers are preparing to rise from their graves once again, to fight a battle that can never be won, in a war that can never end. Sweet dreams.